My name is Maya, and not so long ago, I thought I was living a fairy tale. It's the kind of tale that you hear and think, that must be too good to be true, but for me, it was my reality. It all started in a quaint coffee shop where the aroma of freshly brewed beans filled the air. I was sipping on a latte when I locked eyes with Jack. A natural conversation started, and before we knew it, we were both discussing our favorite films, political viewpoints, and dreams for the future. "I've always wanted to travel the world and write," I said, nervously stirring my coffee. "You know what they say, the world is a book, and those who don't travel read only a page," Jack quoted, smiling at me. "I couldn't agree more," I replied, feeling a connection that was almost palpable. Our relationship moved pretty fast after that, but it never felt rushed. It felt right. 2 years of dating led to a proposal under a sky full of fireworks, and I felt like the luckiest girl alive. The wedding was what dreams are made of. I wore a simple but elegant white dress that complemented Jack's tuxedo perfectly. As I walked down the aisle towards him, the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This was true love. "Do you, Maya, take Jack to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, for better or worse, till death do you part?" the officiant asked. "I do," I replied, my eyes welling up with happy tears. "And do you, Jack, take Maya to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Jack echoed, sliding the wedding ring onto my finger. The celebrations were wild and heartfelt. My friends and family seemed genuinely happy for me, and so did Jack's parents, Karen and George. They welcomed me into their family as if I were their own daughter. "Welcome to the family, Mia. We couldn't have asked for a better daughter-in-law," Karen said warmly, hugging me tightly. "Thank you, Karen. I promise to make your son as happy as he makes me," I said, feeling a sense of contentment that I never thought possible. Jack and I settled into marital bliss quite effortlessly. We moved into a charming little apartment with a view of the park, where we'd often walk hand in hand, talking about our future plans. Maybe a dog, perhaps kids down the line, and lots of traveling. Our home was a cozy sanctuary, filled with love and laughter. Movie nights, home-cooked meals, random dance sessions. Our apartment saw it all. We were young, in love, and optimistic about what the future held for us. Everything was perfect. Or so it seemed until one fateful day when Karen showed up at our doorstep, looking like she had seen a ghost. But that comes later. For a time, I lived in a bubble of happiness, thinking it would last forever. How wrong I was! Life has a peculiar way of jolting you out of your comfort zone when you least expect it. That's what happened to Jack and me on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday evening. I was putting the finishing touches on our dinner. A creamy fettuccine Alfredo, Jack's favorite, when there was a knock on the door. Jack was still at work, and we weren't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Karen stood there, but the warm, radiant woman who had welcomed me into her family was nowhere to be found. This was someone else, a trembling, disheveled shadow of the person I knew. "Karen, what brings you here? Is everything okay?" I asked, concerned, my eyes searching her face for answers. "We need to talk, Mia," she said, her voice quivering with emotion. "It's serious. May I come in?" "Of course," I replied, opening the door wider for her to step inside. I could sense the urgency in Karen's demeanor, so I abandoned the dinner preparations and led her to the living room. As we sat, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Before I could ask her again what was wrong, I heard the door unlock and Jack walked in. "Mom, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" His eyes darted between me and Karen, clearly sensing that something was off. Karen took a deep breath and said, "Jack, Mia, sit down. There's no easy way to say this. Your father is very sick. The doctors say he doesn't have much time left." The room went silent. Time seemed to stop. I looked at Jack and saw his face turn pale, a mixture of disbelief and anguish settling in his eyes. Then I looked at Karen, who was staring blankly at the floor, trying to hide the tears that had started to form. "What do you mean? Doesn't have much time left." Karen wiped a tear from her eye before responding. "He's been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. We've been hiding it, hoping that treatment would work, but the doctors have done all they can." "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner? I had a right to know." Jack's voice rose, his eyes searching Karen's for an explanation. "We thought we could handle it," Karen said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "But we can't. Not anymore. We need you, Jack. We need you both." That evening, our little world shattered into a million pieces. The comfortable, blissful life we had built seemed so fragile now. Suddenly, everything was put into perspective. Our plans, our dreams, our future, all overshadowed by a looming darkness that seemed impenetrable. "We need to go to the estate," Jack said, finally breaking the silence. "We have to be there for Dad." "Of course," I agreed, my mind still racing to absorb the gravity of what we had just learned. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." That night, sleep was elusive. Jack and I lay in bed, each lost in our own thoughts, silently mourning the life we once knew. A life that would never be the same again. It was the end of our innocence, and the beginning of our innocence, and the beginning of a harsh reality we were neither prepared nor equipped to face. And yet, we had no choice but to venture into the unknown. As we pulled into the long, winding driveway of the family estate, my heart sank deeper with every inch the car advanced. The sprawling house that once felt like a symbol of warmth and joy now felt like a colossal monument to impending loss. We walked in to find George lying in bed, looking feeble and exhausted. He managed a weak smile when he saw us, but it was clear that the illness had taken its toll on him. It was devastating to see him this way. The George I knew was robust, full of life, and always telling hilarious stories at family gatherings. Jack rushed to his father's side, taking his hand and sitting beside him in a manner that made him look like a little boy in desperate need of his dad. "Jack," George spoke softly, "I'm so glad you're here, son." "I should have been here sooner, Dad. I didn't know. We didn't know," Jack stammered, guilt and regret clouding his features. "None of that matters now," George assured him, his gaze then shifting to me. I nodded, my eyes welling up. "Where else would I be, George?" Shortly afterward, Karen and Jack pulled me aside. "We have to handle some financial and legal matters," Jack began, his voice heavy. "Would you mind staying with Dad for a few hours each day? He loves your company, and honestly, I can't think of anyone better to keep his spirits up." I felt a mix of emotions, honored to be trusted with such an important task, but devastated by the reason behind it. "Of course, I'll stay with him. You don't even have to ask." For the following weeks, I became George's primary companion, almost like a dedicated nurse, but with a familial touch. I read books to him. His favorites were classic mysteries, watched old movies, and played his favorite music from jazz to rock and roll. Sometimes, he'd share stories from his youth, his face lighting up as he recounted memories of simpler times. "You know, Mia, I've seen the world," George said during one of our afternoon chats. "Traveled to places most people only dream about. But at the end of the day, what matters most is family." "I couldn't agree more, George. Family is everything," I responded, gently holding his hand. "But family is not just about blood. It's about who's willing to hold your hand when you need it the most," he added, squeezing my hand as if to emphasize his point. As I spent time with him, I couldn't help but think how this was building our bond, fortifying a relationship that would last a lifetime. George started to feel less like an in-law and more like a second father to me. It was comforting to believe that even though we were going through a dark period, There was a meaningful emotional connection blossoming amidst the sorrow. But little did I know, my newfound bond with George would become the reason for my undoing in the eyes of the family. I had always heard that life is unpredictable, but I never realized just how drastically it could take a turn until that momentous day when George passed away. In my naivete, I had thought that the worst was behind us, but as I would soon discover, the worst was yet to come. The morning that George passed away started like any other. I walked into his room with a cup of his favorite herbal tea, expecting to see his eyes light up at the small comfort. But something was amiss. The room was too still, the air too heavy. The moment I saw George's face, I knew he was gone. He looked peaceful, as if he were in a deep sleep, but the sparkle in his eyes that I'd grown so accustomed to was extinguished. The scream that escaped my lips was so primal that it didn't even sound like me. Jack and Karen rushed into the room, their faces turning ashen when they saw what had happened. "No, Dad, no!" Jack collapsed beside the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Karen stood there, paralyzed, her face devoid of expression. "Finally," she muttered. "I'll call the undertaker." The week that followed was a blur of condolences, funeral preparations, and endless tears. The estate that was once filled with laughter and conversation was now the epicenter of a palpable sorrow. It was during the funeral that everything took a turn for the worse. As we stood around George's casket, the air thick with the scent of lilies and the somber tones of eulogy, Karen suddenly lashed out at me. She slapped me across the face so hard it stung. "You gold digger!" she hissed, her eyes seething with anger. "You thought you could take advantage of him, didn't you?" "What are you talking about, Karen?" I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe what was happening. I loved George. "Don't lie! You'll never set foot in this family's home again," she spat, drawing stares from the people around us. Jack, who had been quiet throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Mom, what are you doing? Why would you say something like that?" "Why? Because it's true." She cozied up to George, playing the dutiful daughter-in-law, all while eyeing our family fortune. Karen sneered. "I can't believe you're saying this, Karen. I was trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. After everything, how could you think so low of me?" Jack looked at me, then at Karen, torn and confused. "Mom, we're grieving. This isn't the time for accusations. Let's just get through today." We somehow made it through the funeral, but the atmosphere was tainted with a poison that seemed irreversible. When Jack and I returned to our apartment, the tension was unbearable. "You let your mother humiliate me, Jack," I finally said, breaking the silence. "How could you?" "I don't know, Mia." I was shocked. I didn't know what to say, he replied, avoiding eye contact. "Well, you should have said something. Anything to defend me," I snapped, feeling betrayed. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the events of the last few weeks, a message notification lit up my phone. My heart stopped as I read it. $3 million has been credited to your account. My eyes widened in disbelief. Was this George's doing? Had he left me this money knowing what would come after his passing? Questions whirled through my mind, but one thing became painfully clear. This was my chance to break free, to escape the toxic atmosphere that had enveloped me. And so, I made a choice, one that would sever the ties that bound me to a family I once considered my own and set the stage for my ultimate revenge on a woman whose greed knew no bounds. I took a 2-week escape to the Maldives, leaving Jack a note saying I needed space to think. For those 14 days, I disconnected from the world, trying to find my own footing amid the chaos that my life had become. When I returned, I felt a newfound sense of empowerment. I was no longer willing to be a pawn in someone else's game. I barely had time to unpack when the doorbell rang. Upon opening the door, there stood Karen, her eyes downcast and her shoulders hunched. She looked defeated, but whether it was the weight of her guilt or some other burden, I couldn't tell. "Mia, may I come in? I'd like to talk," she said, her voice meek and unsure. "I don't know, Karen. Do you think that's a good idea after what you've done?" I shot back, crossing my arms. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need to apologize." "All right, come in," I said, though I wasn't quite sure why I let her. She took a seat on the sofa, her eyes scanning the room as if she was searching for the right words. Finally, she spoke. "Maya, I know what I did was wrong. I accused you of something terrible without any proof. I let my grief and fear cloud my judgment. I am truly sorry." "That's it? You turned my life upside down and now a simple, 'I'm sorry' is supposed to fix everything?" "Maya, you have every right to be angry, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I was grieving and I didn't know how to handle the loss of George. I made a mistake. I understand that people do irrational things when they're grieving, Karen. But what you did was inexcusable. And where does Jack stand in all of this? Why is he not here defending me?" Karen sighed deeply, her eyes moistening. "Jack didn't know I was coming. I told him I needed to do this myself. I've apologized to him as well for bringing unnecessary turmoil into your marriage." I looked into her eyes, searching for some inkling of sincerity, and in that moment, I felt the walls I'd built over the weeks crumbling. Maybe, just maybe, she was genuinely remorseful. Then my phone buzzed, a message from my bank confirming another deposit. This time, it was a significantly smaller amount, but it was from the same trust fund that had transferred the $3 million. My suspicions immediately reignited. Was this the reason behind Karen's sudden change of heart? Had she found out that George left me a sizable inheritance? I made my decision right then and there. "Karen, I appreciate the apology, but some wounds are too deep to heal, and some bridges are too burnt to rebuild. I want you to leave, and this time, don't come back." Her face crumbled, but she nodded, standing up to leave. "I understand, Maya." I watched her walk away, her figure retreating until she was nothing but a speck in the distance. Then I closed the door, both literally and metaphorically. I was done being the forgiving daughter, in-law, the doting wife. It was time to put myself first. The next morning, I filed for divorce. It was a painful decision, but a necessary one. I needed to break free from a family that had only brought me sorrow and accusations. Now, empowered by newfound financial freedom and a fierce sense of self-worth, I was ready for the next chapter of my life. And as for Karen, she became a cautionary tale in my personal narrative, a harsh reminder that sometimes revenge isn't an act of malice, it's an act of survival. After the divorce papers were finalized, I felt an immense weight lift off my shoulders. I spent the next few months refocusing my energy on myself, taking up hobbies I'd always wanted to try and reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with during my turbulent marriage. The $3 million, invested wisely, provided me with a safety net that gave me both freedom and independence. About a year later, I got an invitation to a charity event, a lavish gala to raise funds for a local hospital. Normally, I'd ignore such social obligations, but when I saw that Karen was part of the organizing committee, I couldn't resist. It was time to show her that her past actions had only made me stronger. I arrived at the event in a stunning black gown, my hair and makeup impeccably done. As I stepped into the grand ballroom, I felt all eyes on me, but none more piercing than Karen's. Her face registered a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something akin to envy. "Maya, you look amazing," she stammered as I approached her. "Why, thank you, Karen," I replied, flashing a practiced smile. "You look well, too." "I heard about the divorce," she said cautiously. "I hope you're doing okay." "I'm doing better than okay. In fact, I've never been better," I assured her. Just then, the event host called everyone's attention for a special announcement. They began to speak about a large anonymous donation that had been made to the hospital. People began to whisper, speculating on who the generous donor might be. Then, the host announced that the hospital's pediatric wing would be renovated and renamed after the mysterious benefactor. At that moment, I took out my phone and pressed a button, triggering a pre-scheduled email to the host. The host looked at the phone in surprise, then announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have just identified our anonymous donor. The pediatric wing will now be named after Maya Williams in honor of her extraordinary generosity." The room erupted in applause, but none of it was as gratifying as the look on Karen's face. A cocktail of bewilderment and begrudging respect. She knew that her actions had failed to bring me down. Instead, they had propelled me to a new level of success and prominence. "Mia, I had no idea," she finally said, her voice tinged with regret. "Life is full of surprises, isn't it?" I replied, reveling in the irony. Jack, who had been standing awkwardly at a distance throughout the evening, finally approached us. "Maya, can we talk?" he asked. "I think we've said all there is to say, Jack," I responded coolly, glancing at Karen as I spoke. Some ties are best left severed. I turned my back to them, joining a group of friends who had been beckoning me over. As the night wore on, I felt a profound sense of victory. Karen had tried to paint me as a gold digger, but here I was, turning that so-called gold into a philanthropic triumph. The best part was, I had emerged from the trials and tribulations stronger than ever.